Thank you for joining me for the July 2018 Diginar. If you're new to the platform, Diginar is just a term I use to describe the short webinars that I release monthly, and they center around the model that I use in my practice, which is DIG, Develop, Improve, and Grow. And it relates to all things regarding professionals, businesses, and leadership. And so what we're going to talk about this month is leading with questions, the power of asking good questions from a leadership perspective. More specifically, what we're going to break it down is in three sections, if you will. The first section is going to talk about where good questions work. So we're going to cover a couple of other areas that are outside the leadership realm, but ultimately we'll dive into that world. Then we're going to talk about how to structure good questions, the difference between open-ended and closed questions, and more importantly, how to frame questions, as we're all kind of familiar with at least one of those topics, but framing a question can be quite important. And then we're going to finish up with examples of good questions. We'll put them in categories as well, because I think it helps to appreciate what your goal is in asking questions, and that helps us to really structure them and get the most out of them, if you will. So where do questions serve us? How do we apply questions on a regular basis? So from a personal development standpoint, it always helps to ask ourselves good questions, right? So, I always say you start with what matters to me, and that provides you the clarity. Where do I want to go? And that's sort of the destination and the purpose. And then why does this matter to me? And that also deals with the purpose of it. And then you finally kind of finish that up with, well, what's prevented me from getting there in the past, and what do I need to do to get there in the future? Sort of that goal setting model. And I know it's sort of cliche, but it really does apply, and it really is important that when setting out for personal development, you're asking good questions. In personal relationships, whether they're colleagues, whether they're family relationships, oftentimes when we get to know people, we tend to assume that we know the way they're thinking, we know how they feel, but unless we're asking questions of each other on a regular basis, we really can't get down to how somebody or where somebody's at that given time. So it's always important to check in and ask questions of the other person to continue to make that relationship thrive. In business, right? So a lot of times I'll get brought in to work with a business that's either struggling or having problems or just looking to grow, right? I say you're either digging in or you're digging out. And so, regardless of the reason I'm brought in, I start every consultancy with a real in-depth question and answer session, right? And so when you're starting a business, if you're in business, it's always important to say, what business am I in? Who is my ideal client? How do I attract and retain talent? What kind of culture do I want to put in the workforce? How do I get my employees engaged? All these questions that should continually be asked throughout the life cycle of a business, not just in the beginning, but throughout the life cycle if it's to continue to grow and to thrive. In sales, the power of asking questions really shines there, because sales is about connection with another individual. That's a topic in and of itself, and I will be covering that a little bit more when I do the extended version of this webinar. And then from a culture perspective, I'm brought in a lot for culture problems. And the way you typically start with this is you have to identify the problem or problems. And how you do that is by asking a lot of questions in a holistic manner. And what I mean by that is you want to ask questions not just of the leadership there, but you also want to ask questions of, the employees, particularly of HR. What's their vision of it? HR representatives that have a lot of experience in the industry and have worked in other cultures will really give you some good insight. But that's something we should always be asking too, even from a business perspective, is the culture that we're creating, and does it line to the vision of the business? And then of course, leadership, which is what we're going to cover today. But before we do that, I want to just bring two principles of leadership front and center. Now, we know there's many, many principles of leadership, but I think as it relates to question asking of our employees or direct reports, however you want to classify them, the people we work with, people that work for us, we want to have these two principles center of mind. And the first one is servant leadership. And that sort of upends the model. Many people think the leader's on top and the employees serve the leader. But in servant leadership model, it provides a new perspective. So when you're a leader, you're no longer, or at least are probably a limited practitioner. And now your job is to get results and things done through others. So if you look at that paradigm and look at it from that perspective, what starts to happen is you start to say, okay, well, what do I need to do to serve them, to empower them, to make them better, so that ultimately I'm accomplishing my job, which is getting results through them. The second principle is that of influence. Leadership is really just about influence, right? It's about winning influence over others, having a trust relationship built. And how does that occur? It occurs through good communication. And part of good communication is asking powerful, relevant, good questions that speak to the heart and minds of the people that we're trying to lead and influence. Now, this notion of asking good questions goes way back. If you look at Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, right? In that, he wrote, ask questions the other person will enjoy answering. So he understood the power of questions back then. Go back even further, 5th century BC, and we talk about Socrates and the Socratic method. It's developed around questions and answering, right? So it talks about relationship building, it talks about debate, it talks about connecting. All of that goes far back. So, we know the power of good questions. But if we know the power of good questions, why do some people still fail to ask them? Well, there's a number of reasons that this occurs. The first reason, I think, is, and in no particular order of ranking, but the first one I want to address is they're eager to impress. They want to impress the other person that they're in the conversation with. And there may be a dynamic that creates this. Like, for example, an interview. Those of you that are in HR that are watching, you'll know this. You'll see people do this. They'll talk and talk and talk because they're eager to impress the interviewers during the interview process. If they stopped and sat back, took time to learn about the interviewers and the organization, it would better equip them to probably speak to particular issues. So, but one of the primary reasons that people, fail to ask good questions is that they're trying to impress the other person. They need to get their opinion out. Everybody needs to be heard. And so a lot of times they just want their opinion out. We see this in political debate a lot, and I'm not going down that path. They don't appreciate the power of questions. A lot of people don't understand that good communication centers around asking the other person questions. When people think about communication, sometimes they think about, okay, well, I need to be doing the talking, when the exact opposite is true. To be a good communicator, oftentimes it centers around listening. They have a false leadership assumption. And what I mean by this is leaders, and when I deal especially with emerging leaders and new leaders, the same theme comes up. They feel that they have to have all the answers, right? Part of this relates back to one of the things that I cover in my workshop is what I call imposter syndrome. They're afraid to be found unworthy. Somebody's going to find me out that I'm not really worthy of this leadership position. But they have the assumption that they have to have all the answers. And when you think that you have the answers, you're obviously not asking the question. And it's not just the volume of questions, right? More goes into it than just the volume of questions that we're asking. It's not just the number of questions, right? We have to look at really the components of questions. And so the first is structure, right? Is it an open-ended question? Is it accusatory or confrontational in nature, by nature? Does it speak to their heart? So that sort of deals with the structure of the question. The emotional component. Do you seem sincere in truly wanting an answer, right? You can't ask questions in a robotic fashion just because you're trying to get questions out and this should be a good thing and something you should do as a leader. So there should be an emotional component to it. I always tell leaders, you have to get curious and you have to be intentional about it. I'm working with a leader now who explained to me, and she's the head of an organization, and she explained to me that she's having difficulty sort of being empathetic. She can be sympathetic, but she's having difficulty being empathetic, and asked me if there was something she could read on it. And I said, it's not that kind of thing. You have to truly ask good questions and continue to ask questions, but you have to do it almost as a detective, right? From a place of curiosity, truly wanting to know the other person. And when you go at it with that, the emotional component of it comes out. And then, of course, the order of questions matter as well, particularly in conflict situations, not so much on a regular basis, but when the conversation is contentious or has the potential to be contentious, well, then the order really matters. Again, in the longer webinar that I'll do on this topic, the order will be covered a little bit more because it's a crucial component when we discuss leading the unleadable or managing our difficult employees. Then there's framing the question. And the example I like to give with framing a question is you can frame a question in a way that's going to make the other person feel comfortable, build some trust, and might go against what you feel a good leader should show. And that's vulnerability. Frame it with vulnerability. So for example, tough example, but let me just try to give you one. So if I'm dealing with somebody and I'm worried that some things in their life are affecting their job performance, I might say to them, we've had some issues lately with performance. I know when I was back, on the line, when I was back doing the job, and I wasn't in the supervisor position, I had some issues as well. And I got called into a very similar situation. And for me, part of the problem was I was dealing with some issues at home, and I had a problem with one of my children, and it was really taking a toll on me at work. So I'm kind of open to listening to all things that might be affecting this, but I just really want to try to get down from your perspective what's going on with you. So you can see that by framing that question and sharing that emotional component, you might get to a better result, if you will. And then, of course, all our nonverbal cues apply as well, right? The tone of our voice, the speed of our speech, our body language, our attentiveness. Are we looking at this device when we're having a conversation that shows this interest? So we know these nonverbal clues. I talk about them quite a bit about how we convey messages without speaking in the communication workshops that I do. So the types of questions we ask, there are categories of questions, if you will. Now, the first three I'm not going to cover because they're pretty self-explanatory. But the last three, I just want to give a brief notice to. And that's first the follow-up questions. There's a lot of power in follow-up questions. And going back to my prior example, if you're truly curious and truly sincere in asking questions of another individual, trying to get to the heart of certain matters, then follow-up questions are necessary because you might get a little bit and have to draw more. You might get a little bit and have to redirect the question. And I really break out questions in two groups: information solicitors and emotion seekers. But understand that these two groups cross over quite a bit. You'll see that when we cover the one section on asking good questions. I'm sorry, the examples of good questions. So from a practical standpoint, it's pretty obvious. We're seeking information, or we're trying to get to the heart of a matter. Those are the difference between information solicitors and emotion seekers. Now, one thing I want to be careful of here is that, I often hear like, well, listen, I'm a leader, I'm not a counselor, right? And, others may say, yeah, I'm a counselor every day. I had a boss I worked for, and I couldn't believe it, but an employee asked him, hey, how come you never had any children? And his answer was, because I have 20 of them right here, and he was referencing all of us, right? That worked for him. So, I get that, but there is a difference between counseling questions and what I consider leaders to be coaches, coaching questions, right? Or mentoring questions, if you will. So from a counseling perspective, we're looking to free from underlying issues. But from a coaching perspective, we're trying to draw out answers that are already within them. They have the answers. We're just trying to wake them up and get them out. So that's the difference, really. We're not looking to, get deep into somebody's background and past, but we're certainly looking to find out what's going on with individuals so that we can get the most out of them, keep them engaged, and, have them be fulfilled as well and do a good job. Now, one of the things, of course, we always want to do is we want to favor the open-ended question. There's a big difference when we ask, the question of, you want to be the leader on that project, right? That's a yes or no question. Or if I say, what role do you want to take in this project? Because that first question obviously implies, even if you know that this person's right for the leadership position, we don't want to put people in leadership positions that don't want to be there or don't feel suited to be there. So if you feel that that's what you've identified them for, by framing the question different, you can get the true answer out. And hopefully they come to it themselves, right? Which goes back to that coaching model. Hopefully they come to it themselves like, yeah, I'd like to lead this team. I think I can do it. So then we're both on the same page. In certain cases, closed questions work when we talk about debating and negotiating and contentious conversations. But more often than not, from a leadership perspective, we want the questions to be open-ended. So let's look at a sample of some good questions. Like I said, I dig into this really deeply on the long version of this, which I'll talk about in a second. But if you look at this and you go back to what I said before, and that is the difference between an information seeker and an information solicitor and an emotion seeker. You can see the crossover here. What can I do to make you more successful? We're asking for information, but there's also an emotional component to that. What are the challenges as you see them? Now, this is really important, even in a group setting, to ask questions like this. You may think you have a handle on what's going on with your team, but again, asking good questions is really the only way to truly know. What opportunities do you see? What do you think we should be doing? This is not a vulnerability. This is not sacrifice your leadership. This is how innovation is born. Good leaders ask these questions. Why isn't this working? What do you need? How can I make it easier for you? How can I empower you more? And what else can we be doing? Your employees, the people that work for you, they have ideas, and many of them may be good. If we close down from a leadership perspective that we have to be the only answer man here or answer woman, then we're certainly missing out on quite a bit, things that we could be doing that, quite frankly, we're probably not. I want to cover one last topic here, and that's asking questions of groups. I do this in a workshop, and what I mean by pick out your stars. You know that you have certain players on your team that will be a little bit more forthcoming. We'll be a little bit more engaged or a little bit more active. And so when I go to do a workshop for an organization and I want to ask questions that get the answers, I try to identify those people in the room. And for me, it's relatively easy when I start a new workshop, because what I'll do is I'll talk to some folks that are, as they're coming into the room, and I'll get to see, you know, whose personality is outgoing and so on and so forth. The other thing that I'll do is I'll start with an exercise, and I'll see who the other members of the group volunteer to lead it. And once you know that, you kind of know who you have as your A players. You might hear a couple of them. And so then when I find those A players, much like you already know yours, I like to look at it as people follow the leader. If I can get one person answering, other people will follow suit. So for the way to really direct this is when you know your A players, when you're asking your questions, make eye contact with those A players. And what that'll do is, again, it'll almost seem to them as if you're asking them directly, and they'll feel more inclined to start out with an answer. So that's just a little trick to sort of ask questions of groups to solicit answers and get everybody involved in it. Because again, like I said, people will play follow the leader with it. One final thought, I just want to say, question everything, right? So we want to ask really good questions. I love that picture of Albert Einstein. Just a little humor there at the end. But again, I think the power of questions is just phenomenal when it comes to leadership. So my email address is here, and I just want to encourage you, any questions that you have regarding this topic, please email me. Any requests you have for topics, I've been getting some requests lately, which I love, because I want to make sure that I'm providing value to what you guys want. Please let me know. Just shoot me an email. And as always, we're going to be doing a comprehensive version of this topic, 90-minute version, if you will. And I always say 15 to 20 minutes to deal with direct problems or issues you may be having. But we're going to do a 90-minute workshop webinar on the power of asking good questions. And we're going to really dive deep into this. And that probably is going to run in August. So if you're interested in that, just shoot me an email. I'll put you on the list to keep you notified of when that's developed. Again, thank you so much, and I really appreciate you being with me. I'll see you on some weekly emails, and hope to hear from you soon. Thanks again.